Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a Merry Christmas. My name is Magnus Petersen, and it is the first time I've started a video with these words, because it has now become hate speech to say ladies and gentlemen and Merry Christmas because of the incredibly stupid times we live in. This video is about long-term stock forecasting. It is based on a paper I recently wrote, which summarizes the research that I have made over the last few years in a number of YouTube videos. The paper and this video also answers some of the puzzles that I didn't yet understand in my previous videos. My hope is that this will make it more accessible to a wider audience. I had also noticed that some people were starting to pass off my research as if it was their own, so I thought I'd better write a normal paper with my discoveries before someone else wrote a paper claiming it was their work. Before I start with the main content of this video, I want to briefly discuss the year 2020, which is now coming to an end. I want to do this because this is my little soapbox where I can speak my mind, but also because I don't have a job, so I can say this without fearing for my job security and income, which is a very real threat for anyone who holds opinions that are deemed politically incorrect nowadays. I will put a link below the video, so you can skip to the video's main content on stock forecasting if you want. This has been a very strange year that people will probably remember for a long time, and I want to discuss the role of academia in the madness we have seen, but it is impossible to ignore the leading roles of the so-called news media and the political left, so let me start with that. I am originally from Denmark, where my family can be traced back at least several hundred years. Denmark is always praised by the political left around the world as the best leftist country that they would all like to copy. But they forget to mention that the high living standard and wealth of Denmark was created by large companies that were started long before Denmark became social democratic, and now Denmark has the world's highest taxes, so the government effectively controls what you spend most of your income on. Furthermore, some years ago, I spent several years traveling the world, often renting rooms in other people's apartments or houses, and living with them for weeks or months. I have probably lived with somewhere between 100 and 200 strangers in their homes, and I can tell you that the people on the political left are some of the most difficult people to live with. It will drive you crazy trying to have a constructive, fact-based debate with people on the left until you understand what fundamentally drives them. The main argument a lefty has is that they are morally superior to everyone who disagrees with them. Their morality is based on whatever they feel is right in the moment. But that's not morality, that's narcissism. And that is the fundamental driver for a leftist. They want to see themselves as being better than you because they have morally superior values and opinions. Leftism is the perfect ideology for narcissism because a person can be virtuous simply by sitting on their butt and pointing their finger at others who are evil. A leftist doesn't actually have to do anything themselves as long as they point their finger at others who are morally inferior. Denmark is full of people who do this. And now with social media and the internet, this leftist, narcissistic virtue signaling has spread like a wildfire throughout the entire world. It is not that there aren't narcissists on the political right or amongst people who don't care about politics at all, but it becomes a particularly toxic form of hypocrisy on the left because they pretend that their politics are meant to help the working class. But it has probably been more than 50 years since left-wing politics has helped the working class. Left-wing politicians still pretend that they are serving the working class so they will continue to vote for them, but in reality the leftists are only serving themselves. We saw this come to full fruition in the year 2020, and nowhere was it more insane than in the United States, where some unfortunate events were magnified to try and overthrow the US president, no matter how many working class people would suffer in the process. Although Europe has had its share of insanity this year, it was nowhere near the level that the United States has seen. You might think that leftists are planning and conspiring how to conquer the world. That's not how I see it. To me, it looks more like opportunism, where they will contradict themselves every 5 minutes if they think it will help them achieve power. We saw this very clearly in the first big event of the year 2020, which was, of course, the so-called coronavirus pandemic. At first, the left was calling the US president a racist xenophobe for closing the borders to China, where the virus originated. The leading leftist politicians even made a Hug a Chinaman Day in the United States to show how the virus panic was overblown and didn't justify closing borders to people with yellow skin. But a few months later, the American left and their lackeys in the news media were blaming the US president for not having closed the borders quickly enough. So he was now responsible for all the people who died. This is typical leftist self-contradiction, and you see it all the time. Fact is that the coronavirus mostly only kills very old and sick people, not exclusively, but mostly. On average, the age of people who died from the coronavirus was around 80 years in Europe. We already knew this when Europe and United States locked down, and the purpose of the lockdown was merely to give breathing room to the hospitals so they wouldn't become overrun as we had seen in Italy, because more people would then die simply from lack of treatment. But many people don't seem to know that the coronavirus is generally without problems for people who are under 70 years old, because the news media does not report on this. I have only seen it mentioned one time in the Danish news media that the average age of corona victims in Denmark was 82 years old, which is several years more than the normal life expectancy. And like I said, we already knew this when Europe and the United States locked down in March 2020, and at that time the factories in China were almost running like normal again after just a few months of lockdown for only some of the regions in China. So we knew this virus did not merit strict lockdowns for many months on end. So why did we do it? Because it became a massive political opportunity for the left. In Denmark, for example, the chief medical doctors repeatedly said to the Prime Minister that she should not lock down the country, and we now have leaked emails that show the doctor said this just hours before the Prime Minister said on national TV that the very same doctors had just advised her to lock down the country, which was therefore a complete lie. Who is this Prime Minister, you ask? It's a social democratic woman in her early 40s who has never had a job, as she has always been in politics. Her education was in the field of Africa studies. I looked it up and I still don't really understand what it is. It's some leftist pseudoscience about Africa. But I do know that it does not qualify her to overrule the country's leading doctors and order a lockdown in direct conflict with their advice, and then lie about it to the nation. More recently, she ordered on national TV that the country's mink fur farmers should kill all their animals, including their breeding animals, thus effectively destroying their entire businesses. The farmers followed the Prime Minister's direct order on national TV because it was urgent, as the coronavirus had mutated inside the mink animals, and this might make the corona vaccines useless for the new mutated virus strain, which could transfer back into humans. Not only does this ignore the fact that the coronavirus mutates all the time in humans as well, and sooner or later it will mutate into something the vaccines don't work for, but it also turned out that the Prime Minister's direct order on national TV was completely illegal. But it was too late because the farmers had already killed all their animals, and then the Social Democratic Prime Minister just said that it wasn't really an order she had given, it was just a recommendation. This is very typical leftist behavior. Now, Denmark was bad, but the media and the other political parties were still asking critical questions to the Prime Minister, so she couldn't go into full Stalin mode. But in the United States, it was much, much worse, because the US media finally had a story that they could milk for months on end to try and save their businesses that are going down because of the internet. And because the US media could try and use the crisis to make President Trump look bad, because they despise him so much. Many millions of working class people lost their jobs in the United States, and many small business owners were in deep trouble because leftist governors locked down their states hard, even though we already knew that the coronavirus is mostly safe for people under 70 years of age, that is, the people who are of working age. One of the reasons that doctors don't want to lock down for a fairly mild virus like corona is that there are so many side effects of a lockdown, and these have indeed turned out to be far worse than the mostly very old and sick people who died from the coronavirus. We are talking everything from cancer that goes undetected to rising drug and alcohol addiction from the despair when people lose their livelihood. I also read that a quarter of young people in the United States had seriously considered committing suicide during this period, and there was a tripling of child abuse cases. And all of this for a virus that most people under 70 years don't even know that they have had. I really hope that we will see a lot of lawsuits in the United States from the people and companies that went bankrupt because of these completely bogus lockdowns. But the left has spun their usual narrative that anyone who disagrees with them must be immoral and evil. So people are afraid to even object to the lockdowns. This is typical leftist tactics. They either intimidate or ridicule, but they never argue with facts. Following the crazy and extremely irresponsible coronavirus lockdowns, there were a lot of so-called mostly peaceful protests in the United States, allegedly over an unarmed black man who died while resisting arrest by the police. This happens only rarely in the United States, but the American left cannot win an election without the black vote, which is why they play the race card so hard. 20 years ago, CNN was regarded as one of the most credible news organizations in the world. But in 2020, a CNN reporter was standing in front of a US city that was being razed to the ground by militant communists and anarchists who were pretending to be anti-racist, and the CNN reporter just repeated the mantra of the left, that the protests were mostly peaceful. The reality is that the organization that orchestrated all of these so-called protests is actually a revolutionary Marxist organization by their founders' own admission. They were not actually protesting. They were not even rioting and looting. They were deliberately trying to start a violent revolution to overthrow the US government and create their own utopia. This was obvious to anyone with half a brain, but we saw several of the largest corporations siding with these Marxist revolutionaries, even when they openly demanded the so-called defunding of the police, which is of course just another word for abolishing the police, and the next step would be to abolish the army so they could have the violent chaos and revolution that they really wanted. And then they would come after the real goal, which is the wealthy elite and capitalism itself. So it was very strange to see big corporations and wealthy people support these communist and anarchist revolutionaries. Maybe it was because the US news media were doing massive censoring and blatant lying, because they also wanted to destabilize the country so President Trump could not get re-elected. Only 3 American presidents have ever been impeached. At the beginning of the year 2020, it was President Trump who was impeached for having encouraged the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son for possible corruption in Ukraine. Who cares? Most people probably don't even know what or where Ukraine is. So why did the American left impeach the president? We now know the reason. During the presidential election campaign in 2020, a laptop computer was found that belonged to the crack addict son of Joe Biden, who mysteriously lands all of these amazing and high-paying jobs around the world. The laptop proved Trump's suspicions were correct. Joe Biden was indirectly receiving bribes from foreign companies and countries through his crack addict son in order to give them access to a high-ranking government official in the United States. And when President Trump got too close to uncover this corruption, the US Democrat Party responded by impeaching him. A few months later, the news media refused to cover the story about the incriminating evidence found on the laptop and instead called it Russian disinformation. The big tech companies did the same and blocked and censored people and newspapers who reported on it. It was absurd to watch this theater play out. But it worked, and the deeply corrupt Joe Biden got elected as the new president of the United States. You know, 4 years ago, I didn't really like Trump. I didn't know very much about him other than he seemed to be a rich businessman with a huge ego and rude manners. He still, to this day, sometimes comes across as a used car dealer on speed to me. And he also insulted my country Denmark by offering to buy a huge part of the country on Twitter, which was not exactly a tactful and diplomatic thing to do to one of America's small, but still most loyal military allies. But the more I looked into Trump's policies and achievements as president, the more I realized he was doing really good things for the average American people. And considering the amount of abuse he had to endure from the left and the media, I believe he was sincere in wanting to help the ordinary American people who were getting absolutely crushed by the billionaire elitists and politicians like Obama and Biden. I then watched the videos that CNN and other news media had put together about how evil and racist Trump was, and there was absolutely nothing there. it was complete BS. In fact, ethnic minorities had never had it so good in the United States as they did under Trump, until the coronavirus conveniently arrived. The American left used the coronavirus to destroy the US economy and the livelihood of millions of its citizens just so they could gain power. I have seen a lot of crazy shit from the European left, but I can tell you that I am utterly disgusted by the American left. It is a tragedy that they went so far to grab the power, but at least we get something out of all this madness, because America is now going to get the funniest president in history. Joe Biden is nearly 80 years old, and he is clearly going senile. He can't remember where he is or what he is talking about. Normally I would feel sorry for a man who is going senile, but Joe Biden is a deeply corrupt person who will destroy the entire world just to gain power. So I can't help laughing when I watch his confused rants. And we might even get so lucky to see a great fireworks display when Joe Biden tries to play basketball with the nuclear football. And the world's leading scientist and head advisor to the US president is going to be a Swedish teenage girl with mental health problems and really bad acting skills. So let me talk a little bit about science and academia's role in the madness we have seen in the year 2020. Before the coronavirus panic, most countries in the world were trying to remain calm and ride out the virus without locking down and destroying our economies. Then came a report from an elite university in England where some world-renowned scientific experts had created a simulation model that said 500 gazillion people would likely die from the coronavirus if we did nothing to stop the spread of the virus. Because of that report, the media and politicians went apeshit, and they locked down the world in direct opposition to the advice of most medical doctors. England locked down hard, and it was illegal to even go outside or go shopping for non-essential items. But guess which professor visited his mistress in spite of it being highly illegal to even go outside, and both of them being married to other people? That's right, the same professor who made the computer simulation that said we were all going to die from the coronavirus. This is another great example of leftist narcissism: one rule for me and another rule for thee. As a true academic, the professor first refused to release the computer code for the simulation model that predicted we would all die. When he finally released it under great pressure, it turned out to be utter and complete crap. This is very typical in academia. One of the big problems in academia is that the process of validating research is completely dysfunctional. An academic review does not guarantee that the research is valid at all. If you think so, it is because you have never been a part of the review process in academic journals. We also saw two of the world's leading medical journals having to retract 2 papers at the height of the coronavirus panic because the papers were seriously flawed. One of them apparently made by a fake research company, maybe paid by big pharma companies to make generic and cheap antiviral drugs look useless against the coronavirus. But at that time, the news media had already run with the dystopian conclusions from the fake papers, so that's what the politicians and the public believed. This is one of the reasons that I personally supply all of the data and computer code for my research in this video, so everyone who watches the video or reads the paper can check for themselves that it is correct. And you can very easily reuse and build on top of my work. That is how academic research should be published, but almost nobody in academia does that. So the incompetence of academia played a big role in creating the coronavirus panic in 2020. Did the professors lose their jobs over the havoc they helped create? Of course not. They have tenure. This brings us to the second big event of 2020, which were the race riots, or shall we call it the attempted Marxist revolution, which also spread from the United States to Europe, but quickly fizzled out in Europe. Like I said, it started with the death of a deeply criminal black man in America while he resisted arrest by the police. But he probably died as much from a drug overdose as from excessive police force. This event was used by the radical left to ignite race riots across the United States to try and bring about a violent Marxist revolution. Academia has had a big role in the proliferation of Marxist ideas as well as so-called identity politics. which are very similar to Nazi race ideology, but turned on its head, so now the colored people are good and the white people are evil and must therefore be destroyed. All of this comes out of academia, where the ideas have been gestating for a few decades, and now the leftist professors had finally indoctrinated and radicalized a whole army of young students to take the revolution to the streets. The reason identity politics has been allowed to grow so strong and dominant in academia, even though it is complete and utter pseudoscientific crap, is because of the cowardice of the few real scientists that are still left in academia. They should have crushed identity politics in its infancy as the blatantly racist hate ideology that it is, but instead they let it grow and grow until it became a huge monster. Ironically, the monster is now starting to devour all the white male professors who allowed this to happen, and I cannot help chuckling at that. Unfortunately, it is not going to stop there, as the monster is already coming for the rest of us. I don't know what the solution is to all of this madness, and with the election of the new US president, the deeply corrupt and senile Joe Biden, who is going to be a puppet for the hard left, I think it is only going to get worse. So we need to address these problems whenever we can, and that is indeed why I decided to talk about them here on my little soapbox. Now let us move on to the real topic of this video, which is long-term stock forecasting. Academic finance is also mostly pseudoscience, and perhaps it has been just as destructive to the world as the coronavirus panic and identity politics. For almost 50 years, academia has been adamant about capital markets being so-called efficient at pricing stocks and other assets, so the price of an asset is always correct for the risk and reward long-term investors will get. But their so-called research didn't actually prove this, and one of the few sensible finance professors, a man named Robert Shiller, won a Nobel Prize in part for his work that showed long-term stock market returns strongly depend on the valuation ratio at the time you make the investment. But he only studied the empirical data and never formally proved the reason why, which we will do here in just a moment. There are many theories and philosophies in finance, from the old school Ben Graham type of value investing to the maxims of Warren Buffett and the more mathematical ideas such as discounted cash flows and CAPM. It is very easy to get confused by all these ideas, and it seems very difficult to put them all together into one coherent framework. What we are going to do in this video is to boil down long-term investing to its pure essentials. We will derive the valuation formulas from basic mathematical definitions for stock returns and show exactly how the current valuation ratio, together with our best guess for the future valuation ratio and the company's future growth and dividend yield, all come together in a couple of fairly simple mathematical formulas that can be used to estimate the future returns on individual stocks and entire stock indices. Okay, so what you see here is a so-called Python notebook, which contains the computer code for running all of the experiments from the paper. You can download this by clicking on the link below the video, where you can also get the data, so that you can rerun all of the experiments and you can build on top of this very easily. I'm not gonna go through this notebook now, but it's very well documented, so hopefully it's easy to understand. This is the paper, and you can see from the table of contents that it starts with the mathematical forecasting model and then has a number of case studies. What I'd like to do in this video is to go back a few steps, because I think it is helpful if you understand the motivation for making this forecasting model. This is a plot from a book called Irrational Exuberance, 3rd edition from the year 2015, written by Robert Shiller, and it's the only plot he has in this book about this, but I think it's the best plot that he has made in all of his papers and books and so on that I am aware of. I did not read this book when it came out, I only just read it recently, so I was not aware of this plot when I started investigating this. But anyway, what it shows is a scatter plot. On the x-axis we have the price to earnings ratio, the CAPE ratio, which is cyclically adjusted PE ratio, so it takes the average earnings for the trailing 10 years and uses that in the PE calculation, instead of just using the earnings from the trailing 1 year, which is much more unstable. On the y-axis, we have the annualized subsequent 10-year return, and the dataset goes from 1881 to 2013, and each of these data points represent January in each year, so the CAPE ratio for that date and the subsequent 10-year annualized returns on the S&P 500. And the important thing to note here is that there is a general trend so that when we have higher valuation ratios or CAPE ratios, we have lower annualized return in the following 10 years. And vice versa, when we have low CAPE ratios or valuation ratios, we have a high annualized return in the following 10 years. In his book, Shiller writes that depending on what function you fit to this, you can get wildly different predictions for the future, especially when you go outside of the historical data range where the function may not fit very well. So what Shiller did was he observed this pattern in the data and said it looks like something is going on here, but he didn't investigate why do we see this pattern, what is the exact formula that we should fit to this data, and how do we use this formula in forecasting, perhaps not only a center point, but both a center point and a spread of the distribution, that is a mean and a standard deviation, which I will show you how to do in a moment. And also when does it work and when does it not work and why. The first step in making a scientific discovery based on empirical observations is just to look at the data. But in order to make a proper scientific theory, you need to explain it and say, what are the mechanics working in this system? What we will actually see in a moment is that there is a precise mathematical formula for this. So anyway, I was not aware of this plot until recently. The only plots I had seen from Shiller were not as clear as this one. So I wrote a little book in 2015, and it has a combination of things, and it has some fairly simple investment strategies for the S&P 500 and so on. But perhaps the most important thing in that book was this plot here. So on the x-axis, I show the valuation ratio, the price-to-book ratio for the S&P 500. And on the y-axis, I show the annualized return. So again, we take some data point here, for example, and this is for some particular date. And then on the x-axis, we have the price-to-book ratio for that date. And on the y-axis, we have the annualized return going forward. And for this plot here, it is for 1 year. So that was maybe minus 7%. And we do that for all the dates in the data set that we have. And I did that for 1 year, and for 3-year investment periods, and for 6-year periods, and for 10-year periods. And let's zoom out a little so that you can see that for 1 and 3-year investment periods, there's not a clear relation between the valuation ratio and the future annualized return on the S&P 500. For 6 years, there is actually a really good connection, but there's a huge outlier here and a huge outlier here. But for 10-year investment periods, it's actually a quite good fit. Clearly something is going on here. What I do here is I use daily data points. Shiller only used annual data points. He had a data set going back to 1881, and I think the data I'm using only goes back to 1978 or something like that. But again, I use daily data points, and it makes it much clearer to see this connection between the valuation ratio and long-term annualized returns on the S&P 500. I just fitted a straight line here. So a few years later, I decided to write this as a Python notebook, and I started experimenting with other stocks, and I also experimented with averaging the investment period, so it was not precisely 10 years. In this plot, for example, it was between 7 and 15 years, and this is for the stock for the company called Procter & Gamble. And what we're ultimately interested in is to use this for prediction, so that today we can use it to predict what is going to happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years with this stock or another stock or the S&P 500 or whatever. And in order to do that, we need some kind of function. And clearly we see in this plot here, there is a connection between the price to sales ratio and the mean annualized returns for investment periods of 7 to 15 years. But I didn't know what formula that was. I just looked at the data and said, well, it's not a straight line. It has a bend to it. So let's try and fit it with a reciprocal curve like this. So we got this formula up here for the mean annualized return. I also tried doing this for the company Walmart, which also has data going back like 40 years or something. And here you see there's a very bad fit for the reciprocal curve because the data points now have some kind of levels to it. There's a curve here and a curve here and some zigzag curves in between here. There is the downward slope that we also saw before, but it's not one curve, it's several curves now. And we will explain that in a moment why that happens, but this puzzled me for some time. Why does it do that? Before we get to that, I just want to show you another paper. This is actually quite good. It is written by an investment professional named Keimling in 2016, so a year after I wrote my book, and a year after Schiller published his last edition of his book Irrational Exuberance. And here they are using the CAPE ratio as well, but instead of just looking at the S&P 500, they also look at many other countries. He also did not know which function or which system is actually generating this data, so he fitted another curve. He fitted a negative logarithmic function, which has the same kind of downward slope that I had in my reciprocal function, because that is what you kind of see in the data points as well, that they have this characteristic downward slope. So again, what is it we want to do here? We want a function where we can input something like a valuation ratio or maybe even more variables and parameters so that we get an estimated future return out. That's our goal. That's what we are after. Schiller tried to do it. I tried to do it. This guy Keimling tried to do it. But in all of those books and papers, we didn't know which function is generating this. It turns out it's actually really simple. So let's go to my new paper. And I actually discovered this already 2 years ago in one of my Python notebooks. I discovered the formula and put it on the internet and YouTube and so on. But not a lot of people are going to discover that. And I also noticed that people, probably young kids, were starting to steal my work and use it for their own university projects and whatnot, and pretending it was their work. So I thought, okay, I better write this paper, not only to make sure that I get credit for this discovery, but also to make it available to a much wider audience who are not going to find my YouTube videos and my source code on GitHub. So here it is. So we're going to start with the mathematical forecasting model, because now you understand what the motivation is for having such a model. And then I'm going to go through some of the case studies to show you how it works and how it fits the data and when it works and when it doesn't work and so on. I'm not going to go through the entire paper because the video would be very long. I recommend that if you're really interested in long-term investing, that you read the entire paper carefully. In the case studies, I highlight different aspects of the model, when it works and when it doesn't work, and explain why. There are important observations and discussions in most of the case studies, and especially the first ones go in great detail on how to use the forecasting model. So the first thing we have to define is called the total return of a stock or a stock market index. I have chosen to write it like this, and I'm not entirely happy with my notation here, but let me explain what it means. The total return is defined as the number of shares that we own multiplied by the share price at a given time step t. And what I mean by this number of shares is not how many shares are outstanding for the company. It is how many shares that we own, and we assume that this will grow from reinvestment of dividends without having to pay any taxes. That is what the total return means. I don't show the formula for this reinvestment of dividends and how the number of shares increases from one time step to the next when a dividend is paid out and reinvested in the same stock, because we're not really going to use that formula, and I didn't want to confuse people with that. So you should just keep in mind that what this total return is basically just the share price multiplied by a number that keeps growing whenever we reinvest dividends into more of the same shares. Next, we define the annualized return between time step t and t plus years. And we could have written it like this to make it absolutely clear that it is between these two time steps, but it would get a bit long to write like this all the time. So you just need to keep in mind that when it says annualized return for time step t, it implicitly means that it is between time step t and t plus years. And this is defined from the total return between time step t and t plus years. And this is taken to the power of 1 divided by years, and then minus 1. This is just the standard formula for calculating the annualized return, which you probably already know if you have some experience investing. What we then do is we take the definition that we gave of the total return in the previous formula and insert that into this formula here, so that we now have that the total return in time step t plus years is actually the number of shares that we own at that time step, which has grown from the reinvestment of dividends, multiplied by the share price at that time step, divided by the number of shares that we own today, multiplied by the share price today, or at time step t. Again, we take that to the power of 1 divided by years, and subtract 1 to get the annualized number. So there's no hocus pocus here, it's just straightforward. Then we define the valuation ratio price to sales as the share price at time step t divided by the sales per share for the trailing 12 months at time step t. So for today, for example, it would be the share price of today and the sales per share for the year leading up to today. We can do a trivial rewrite of this definition so that we get that the share price equals the price to sales multiplied by the sales per share. This is just a very basic mathematical identity. No hocus pocus here. We then rewrite this formula up here by using this definition of share price down here, the price to sales ratio multiplied by the sales per share. Take this, insert it up here, and then we get this formula right here. And I have annotated it with some labels, so it's extra clear that we have 3 components now. The first one here is for reinvestment of dividends. The second is for revaluation, so the change in valuation ratio. And the final component is the growth or the change in sales per share. All of this follows directly from the definition of total return and annualized return and the valuation ratio. So there's no hocus pocus here. This is a perfect mathematical identity. It is important that you understand that if you can predict the change in the number of shares from the reinvestment of dividends, the change in the valuation ratio, and the growth in the sales per share, then you can precisely predict the future annualized return. Pause the video until this is absolutely clear to you. Hopefully now this is obvious to you, and that is why I write in the paper that it is almost embarrassingly obvious in hindsight. I don't know why I didn't realize this much sooner. We're gonna simplify this further. Don't worry, it's gonna be even easier to use than this. I have read a lot of books on investment finance, both from practitioners and from academia, and I only think I have seen one time mentioned that for a long-term investor, what counts is the dividend, the change in valuation ratio, and the growth of the company or the stock index. And I think that might have been in Bogle's book on index investing. I'm not exactly sure, but he didn't give a formula, he didn't derive it, and I think he meant that you should add them together, and as we will see in a moment, that's actually not correct. This is the correct formula because it is derived from the definition of total return of a stock and how to calculate the annualized return of a stock and what the valuation ratio is defined as. I repeat it again and again and again that this is a mathematical identity. It's a fact that these are the 3 components that determine long-term investment returns. Now the problem we have here is that we don't know precisely what the future is going to bring in terms of dividends and revaluation and sales growth, so we like to estimate a distribution of possible outcomes. A typical way to summarize a statistical distribution of possible outcomes is to use the mean and the standard deviation. The mean is the center of the distribution and the standard deviation is the spread of the distribution. So let's now see how we're going to calculate that. The notation I like to use for the mean or the average of some random or stochastic variable x is E square brackets x. STD, I just realized that normally has another meaning as well, but here it means standard deviation. And I'm actually not sure this is the standard way of writing it, but it's the way I like to write it. So that's how I write it in my paper. So let's start with the mean. So we simply take the mean or the expectation operator and apply it to the formula that we just had for the annualized return. So we get this long beast in here, and we want to try and simplify this. The first thing you should note is that this number here, the price to sales ratio at time step t, is actually not a random variable. This is not a random variable either, and this one is not a random variable either, because all of these numbers are known today. But what we're interested in is to create a formula that basically just takes the valuation ratio, in this case the price to sales ratio, as its input, and it spits out the mean annualized return that we can expect in the future. So we want to take the price to sales ratio out of the mean operator, and we can do that because it is not a random variable, it's a scalar variable. And similarly, we can take this -1 outside of the square brackets as well. And what we end up with is this formula here. So we have the mean of this stuff up here divided by the price to sales ratio at time step t to the power of 1 divided by years. and then all of this minus 1. So this is just a simple rewrite. And at this point, we haven't made any estimates or anything. This is just following the definitions of the total return, the annualized return, the price to sales ratio, and the mean operator. So this is completely mathematically precise and valid. Now we want to simplify it a bit further. So we're going to assume that this component here for the reinvestment of dividends, which grows the number of shares that we own, and the future price to sales ratio, and the growth in the sales per share, we're going to assume those three components are independent statistically. This is probably not a completely valid assumption, but what it means is that we can change the formula slightly so that now we calculate the expectation or the mean for each of the components individually. And at first glance, this might look a lot more complicated, but let's go through each of the components in turn and see what they actually are. So we start with the first component, which is the growth in the number of shares from the reinvestment of dividends. This is annualized by taking it to the power of 1 divided by years. And if you think about it for a while, when you get a dividend payout and you invest it immediately back into the same stock, what matters is the amount of the dividend payout and the price of the stock that determines how many shares you can buy. So the average annual growth in the number of shares from reinvestment of dividends is approximately equal to the dividend yield. The reason there is a plus 1 is because the dividend yield can be a number, say 0.04 for 4%, but it really should be 1.04, so we need to add 1 because that is what we would get if we calculate it similarly with this thing over here. So let's look at the next component, which is for the future price to sales ratio. When we take the expectation of that, we actually only change the notation here slightly because what we mean by this price to sales ratio for times the t plus years, it is just the future distribution of price to sales ratios, and this is implicitly understood. So we remove the index here, t plus years, and then we just need to annualize this number by taking it to the power of 1 divided by years. Whether we apply this exponentiation inside or outside the expectation operator does actually matter. It is a mathematical phenomenon known as Jensen's inequality, and Jensen was another Danish man, by the way. The correct way of doing it is inside the expectation operator because it will give a slight error if we do it outside. That is what Jensen's inequality states. Because taking something to the power of 1 divided by years is a nonlinear function. In some cases, the error is very small and it doesn't really matter. In other cases, the error can be quite large. So if you're calculating all of this using a computer, you should always do it inside the expectation operator like this. But if you want to do it quickly by hand using a pocket calculator, you can do it outside, and you just need to keep in mind that you introduce a little more error. But because these are guesses about the future anyway, the error from Jensen's inequality is probably going to be a minor issue. So anyway, the component with the future price to sales ratio is just tiny change of notation because we know that we're talking about the distribution for the future time step t plus years. The last component is the growth in the sales per share between time step t and t plus years, and then it has been annualized again by raising it to the power of 1 divided by years. And if we assume that the growth is independent from year to year, then this is approximately equal to the annual growth in sales per share. And again, we just need to plus 1 here because we think of this as a percentage number, for example, 5% or 0.05. But in the formula, it really needs to be 1.05, and that's why we plus 1. These arguments are a bit hand-wavy. The thing about mathematics is that you need to strike a balance between precise mathematical formality and verbal explanation. But I think the arguments I have given here are sufficient, so we can now rewrite the formula for the mean annualized return to be some number A divided by the price to sales ratio to the power of 1 divided by years minus 1. And the number A is defined, as I just explained, as the mean dividend yield plus 1 multiplied by the mean future price to sales ratio to the power of 1 divided by years multiplied by the mean annual growth in sales per share plus 1. So this formula here combined with this formula here gives us an estimate for the mean annualized return. So we have a fairly simple formula for estimating the mean annualized return in the future based on the price to sales ratio today and our best guess for the average dividend yield in the future. and the average price to sales ratio in the future, and the average annual growth in sales per share. This was exactly what we wanted, and as you will see in a moment, this is precisely the shape of the curves we observed in the historical data in the papers I showed you a moment ago. So now we have the center of the distribution for the future annualized returns. What about the spread of the distribution? That is the standard deviation, and we simply apply that operator to the formula that we had a moment ago for the annualized return. Once again, because the price to sales ratio at time step t is a number that is known, it's not a stochastic or a random variable, we can pull that out of the standard deviation calculation, and the -1 is just removed according to the mathematical laws of how the standard deviation works. So then we get this formula down here where we have the standard deviation to all of this stuff here divided by the price to sales ratio for today to the power of 1 divided by years. All of this stuff up here, we call that for B, and then the formula becomes like this: B divided by the price to sales ratio at time step t to the power of 1 divided by years. And using similar arguments as we did before, we get that the number B is defined as the standard deviation of the dividend yield plus 1 multiplied by the future price to sales ratio to the power of 1 divided by years multiplied by the annual growth in sales per share plus 1. But even if we assume that these random variables are independent, the closed form formula would still be very difficult if we want to separate these out into the standard deviation for the individual components. So what we do in practice is that we either use the historical data directly, so the computer program simply takes all of the historical dividend yields, the historical price to sales ratios, and the historical annual growth in sales per share, and it just calculates it for all of that. If you don't want to use the historical data, and you don't want to write down thousands of combinations of the dividend yield or price to sales ratio and so on, when it's calculated this way, these three components are dependent of each other. But we can make a simple approximation using Monte Carlo simulation and assuming that they're independent. This is not completely accurate, but in practice it works quite well. So now we have two formulas for the mean and standard deviation of the annualized return, where we need to calculate two numbers, the parameter A and the parameter B, and these are calculated from guesses about the future distributions for the dividend yield, price to sales ratio, and annual growth in sales per share. And once we have calculated parameters A and B, we can then insert them in the formulas to calculate the mean and standard deviation using the price to sales ratio for today. Exactly what we wanted. This is really, really great. I have been chasing this for years. Robert Shiller has been chasing it his entire life. And it turns out it's really simple. The trick is to do the rewriting that I did at the beginning of this mathematical derivation. And if you're good at mathematics, you wonder, hey, why do this? I mean, it's trivial. You're just rewriting things from their definitions. Well, not exactly, because what we did was we decomposed the total return for a stock into three components. Its dividend yield, its change in valuation ratio, and the growth in, for example, sales per share. And this is useful because for some stocks and some stock indices, it is much easier to predict the three components individually than predicting the stock returns directly. Now, in day-to-day investment analysis, for example, when I look at a stock and I want to see what is the kind of return I can expect on this stock, I don't actually use the precise multiplicative formula that you just saw. I use this one. Mathematically speaking, if we have two numbers x and y, and they are fairly close to zero, say something like plus or minus 0.2 or plus or minus 20%, which is typically the range that we're dealing with when we're talking investment returns, then we can use this simple approximation to get from a multiplicative formula to an additive formula. So when we use this for the mean annualized return, we can, instead of multiplying all of these together to calculate the number A and then insert that in the formula and so on, we can look at the individual components. So it's approximately equal to the mean dividend yield plus the mean annual growth in sales per share plus the mean annualized change in valuation ratio. So you make your best guess for the future dividend yield, future growth in sales per share, and your best guess for the future price to sales ratio, divided by today's price to sales ratio, Then you calculate the annualized return from this revaluation by taking this to the power of 1 divided by years. I normally calculate this in a calculator because I cannot do this in my head. You add all of these numbers and you get an estimate for the mean annualized return on the stock. This is how I typically do it in daily investment analysis. And using Ben Graham's all margin of safety principle, yes, the formula is more imprecise than the correct multiplicative formula, but all of these guesses are very imprecise anyway. So whether the estimate comes out as 20% or 25% or 30% probably doesn't matter very much. In the Tesla case study in this paper, I use this formula in a slightly different way. I say, let's assume the future dividend yield is 0, and then let us guess what the valuation ratio is likely going to be 10 years into the future. Then how much does the company need to grow its sales per share in order for the annualized return simply to be 0, simply to be break even? So the formulas until now and all of the case studies in this paper assume that there are no taxes, not on capital gains and not on dividends. The thing is that the formulas very quickly become very complicated when you want to adjust for taxes. And in this section here, I give a very basic example, and even that gets a little complicated. But I'm not going to talk about this anymore in this video, because all of the case studies are without taxes. Let me briefly talk about the choice of valuation ratio. The good thing about the price to sales ratio is that it is numerically stable. What I mean by that is that the sales per share is typically always greater than 0 for publicly traded stocks. This means that the price to sales ratio is always well defined. The problem is that it is difficult to interpret and you cannot easily compare it across companies because it has to do with different profit margins as well. Intuitively, it is easier to understand the PE ratio or the price to earnings ratio. And in fact, it's even more intuitive to flip this on its head and say the earnings yield. But let's just talk about the PE ratio here. The problem with that is that the earnings per share fluctuates a lot more than the sales per share. The earnings per share can also be 0 and it can be negative. And that means the PE ratio is not well defined anymore. The way Robert Shiller solved this problem is that he used what he called the cyclically adjusted PE ratio, which takes the trailing 10 years of earnings, takes the average of that, and uses that number in the calculation of the PE ratio. The problem with that is that it can greatly underestimate the earnings potential now if the company or the stock index has had significant sales growth over the last 10 years, because implicitly the CAPE ratio actually uses the average sales per share for the last 10 years, and this may be a little tricky to understand. It is probably much better to use the sales per share for the last year multiplied by average net profit margin for the last 10 years. That should give you a better estimate of the average earnings for this year. And if you want to redo all of these experiments with that valuation ratio, I would be most interested in seeing the results. The advantage of that would be that the valuation ratio is a lot easier to compare across companies. Anyway, this is the explanation why I use the price to sales ratio, because it is easy to calculate and it is numerically more stable than the PE ratio. Oh, and another thing, by the way, if you want to use 10-year averages, as in the CAPE ratio or the variation of that I just explained how to calculate, then you would have to use 10 years of data for each valuation ratio. If you want to look at 10-year future returns, that means that for a data set which has 20 years of data, you only get one data point. Okay, that's not very much. And the data sets I'm using in this paper, a lot of them are not even 20 years. So anyway, these are the reasons why I use the price to sales ratio. Now let us look at what I call return curves. Remember the papers I showed you before from Robert Shiller, myself, and the investment professional? All of these had a particular downward slope. And it turns out that this actually comes directly from the definition of the annualized return. So let us just quickly go back to the formula that we had derived for the mean annualized return. It was some number A divided by the price to sales ratio at the time step t to the power of 1 divided by years minus 1. What we want to do now is to plot this function to see what it looks like. So first we normalize it by setting A to 1. You can think of this as the number A being defined as having 0 dividend yield, 0 sales growth, and a future price to sales ratio of exactly 1. And then we want to plot this for various choices of the price to sales ratio at the time step t and various choices of the number of investment years. So we have that in this plot here. And you will notice that I often drop the subscript t when I say price to sales. And this might be a little confusing because sometimes it's a distribution, but in this case it is a fixed number, which is meant to be the price to sales ratio at the time we make the investment, okay? So recall that we had no dividend yield, we had no sales growth, and the future price to sales ratio was set to exactly 1. So if the price to sales ratio today is also 1, we have that on the x-axis here, the varying price to sales ratios, and if that is 1, then we go up on the y-axis where we have the annualized return, and we see we have exactly 0% in annualized return. When the price to sales ratio is lower, the annualized return grows. When the current valuation ratio is higher, so when we buy a stock or a stock index at a higher price to sales ratio, then the future annualized return is lower. And the curve has a particular shape. And this goes all the way back to the definition of annualized return. Remember, in simplified form, the formula looks like this. We assume the number A was 1, then divided by the price to sales ratio to the power of 1 divided by years minus 1. When we plot this function here, we get this curve here. So what are the different curves? That is for different investment periods. The most steep curve is for 1 investment year. And the next one, the yellow curve, is for 2 investment years. The next one, the green one, is for 3 investment years. The red one is for 4 investment years, and so on. What this means is that as the investment period becomes longer, the return from the revaluation, the change in valuation ratio from the price to sales ratio when you buy the stock until you sell the stock, the annualized return of that is going to be less dramatic because it is spread over more years. For example, if we have a price to sales ratio of 0.5 today, and in 1 year we sell the stock at an assumed price to sales ratio of 1, it gives us a 100% return from just this revaluation. If instead we hold the investment for 2 years, then the annualized return, that is the compounded return over 2 years, is something like, let's say 42%, as we can see here. If instead we hold it for 3 years, then the annualized return is only something like, let's say 27%, because the doubling from a price to sales ratio of 0.5 to a price to sales ratio of 1 now occurs over 3 years. So the compounding factor has to be spread over 3 years instead of just 2 years as here or 1 year as here. So that is why the return curves become flatter and flatter and flatter the longer the investment period is. So now we have the first case study, which is for Tesla. And this uses the simplified forecasting model, which is additive and not multiplicative. And remember, this is more imprecise, but it is useful for daily investment analysis that you can quickly calculate in your head and with a pocket calculator. Tesla's stock has increased more than tenfold in the year leading up to when I wrote this case study in August 2020. And what I do in this case study is to say, well, assume that the company was already profitable at a profit margin of 10%, and assume in 10 years it is going to trade at a PE ratio of 20, then how much is it necessary for the company to grow its sales and earnings per share in those 10 years in order to justify the current level of the share price? I'm not going to go through this in detail here because the video is already getting longer than I really wanted it to be, but you can read the case study yourself and you will see it is necessary for the company to have massive growth in its sales and earnings per share in order to justify the share price in August 2020. And you may say, oh, this is way, way, way too optimistic, and the stock is probably going to drop dramatically, and you may be tempted to short the stock. But the problem is that shorting is a very short-term and speculative strategy, whereas this kind of forecasting only works in the long term. And we will see that in all of the other case studies in this paper, that for short periods of only 1 to 3 years, forecasting from the valuation ratio typically does not work. And just a few months later, I'm now recording this video in December 2020, and Tesla stock has already increased more than 35% from when I wrote this case study, and the valuation ratios were already insane. So now let's look at a few case studies where we use the actual real forecasting model. First, we look at Procter & Gamble. Now this is an important case study for you to read in great detail because it explains how the forecasting model works and what the plots are showing and so on. So even if you're not interested in this particular company, you really need to read this case study. But I will jump straight to the first plot, and we have that here. So the first plot up here has a logarithmic y-axis, and the blue erratic line here is the share price. It is not the total return. The total return would basically look the same, but it would have reinvestment of dividends, so over time it would have grown more than the share price alone, but otherwise it would look almost exactly the same. The yellow dashed line is the sales per share, and we can see they have sort of grown together, but this is more clear when we look at the ratio between them. So for each data point here, we take the share price divided by the sales per share, and then we get the point down here. And this looks like it has been kind of mean reverting around a mean value of 2.7. There are some outliers here in the mid-1990s and here around 2020, but otherwise it has been fairly close to its historical mean. Now let us look at the plot for the annual sales growth. And this also looks kind of mean reverting with a mean value of about 3.7, which is shown as this dotted black line here in the middle. And the last plot here shows that the mean dividend yield was around 3.5. And for most of the time, the dividend yield has been between 2.5% and 4%, with an outlier here in the mid-1990s, where we also saw that the price to sales ratio was really low. And there the dividend yield was almost 10%. Now what we're going to do with the forecasting model is we're going to take all of these historical averages for the dividend yield, sales growth, and the price to sales ratio, and we're going to use that to calculate the number A in the forecasting formula. And in the next plot, we have that formula here. So the mean annualized return, the number A equals to 2.88, then divided by the price to sales ratio to the power of 1 divided by 1 year, which is just 1. That's the price to sales ratio. The formula is very simple for 1 year. It is indeed reciprocal for 1 year. And similarly, we calculate the parameter B for the standard deviation using the standard deviation of the historical data that you just saw. And we get this formula here. And when we plot the mean annualized return using this formula here, it is this solid black line in the plot down here. And the green line here is the mean plus 1 standard deviation, so using both of these formulas. And the red lines is the mean plus and minus 2 standard deviation using these formulas up here. Also shown in this plot are the historical annualized returns for the Procter & Gamble stock. These are for 1 year periods. So basically what we do, we take for each date in the data set, we look up the price to sales ratio at that date, then we calculate the annualized return from that date and going 1 year forward, and then we put 1 dot inside this plot. We do that for all the dates in the dataset for this stock, and then we get all of these dots. And the colors of the dots are for different periods of time. So dots that have a similar color are for the same period in time. For example, the blue ones here is for 1 period in time, and the yellow ones are for another period in time. I should mention that you cannot compare the colors between the different plots. So this plot, for example, is for 5-year annualized returns, but you cannot assume that the colors are for the same periods. They might be, they might not be. But you can use the colors to see within one plot which dots go together for different periods in time. So let's go back to the plot for 1 year annualized returns, and this is very typical that there is no real clear relation between the valuation ratio, price to sales, versus the 1 year returns on the stock. The R squared is minus 0.58, and normally we say that the R squared is between 0 and 1, where 0 would mean that our forecasting model was no better than simply taking the average of the values on the y-axis and use that. But in this case, because the forecasting model is nonlinear, it can have a negative R squared value. But an R squared value of 1 still means a perfect fit, which would be exactly somewhere on the line for the forecasting model's mean, so this black curve here. Notice that the R squared value is only calculated using the mean of the forecasting model, so the black line. it does not take into account that the forecasting model actually produces both a mean and a standard deviation. So for example, if we move on to the next plot for 5-year annualized returns, now we have an R-squared value of 0.61, which is quite good, but we also see that most of the historical data points are within one standard deviation of the forecasted mean, except for this outlier up here. And if we look at 10-year annualized returns on the Procter & Gamble stock, we get an R-squared of 0.76, and again most of these are within one standard deviation of the forecasted mean. Let's just go back to the plot for 5-year annualized returns. Typically, when we are doing long-term investing, we are not interested in exactly 5-year annualized returns. We are more interested in an average estimate for, let's say, 4 to 6 year investment periods. So let's see what that looks like. And we have that in the plot on the next page. And we can see that the outliers become more smooth now. The formula for the forecasting model is actually the same as for exactly 5-year periods. The difference lies in the historical data that we show in the scatter plot, which are now smooth between 4 and 6 years, and the R-squared value that we calculate between those smooth historical data points and the forecasting model's mean. So now we get a better R-squared of 0.75. The next plot shows it for investment periods between 6 and 10 years, and now the R-squared is 0.80. And if you look at the plot, you will see that the curvature of the historical data points closely follows the curvature of the forecasting model, what I call the return curves. It looks like there are 2 levels, one here and one here with the yellow dots, but both of these levels are merely parallel to the forecasting model's mean. So the formulas for the forecasting model that we have written up here look like they are the correct formulas for the historical data, for the empirical data that we have observed. Remember Schiller's book, my old book, and the other research paper that we saw in the beginning of this? None of us at that point knew which formula was correct. Was it linear? Was it reciprocal? Was it logarithmic? What was it? All of those were wrong. The correct one is this formula here. It might take a while before you fully wrap your head around this and fully understand all of it, but it goes back to the very definition of annualized return, which was used to calculate these historical data points, and it was used to plot this line here. The magical thing is that we can plot this line based on 3 components of the stock data, which was the dividend yield, the price to sales ratio, and the growth in sales per share. And this also means that we can change the assumptions for the future very easily. And when you see different levels in the historical data like here, it is because there were periods of time where, for example, the historical price to sales ratio was a little above the mean that we used in the forecasting model, and for the yellow dots here, it was a bit below the mean that we used in the forecasting model. For some stocks, this is much more extreme, and that is one of the things that puzzled me for a long time before I realized that the forecasting model was really composed of these 3 components. So let us briefly look at the case study that puzzled me for a long time, and that was Walmart. And once again, we will skip directly to the plots for the historical data, but I strongly encourage you to read all of the text if you're interested in long-term investing. So here we show again as the blue erratic line the share price of the Walmart stock, and as the more stable yellow dashed line we have the sales per share. It is remarkable in this plot how much they have followed each other. Sometimes one is above the other, and at other times it's reversed. And it's easier to see that if we plot the ratio between them, the price to sales ratio, which we have in this plot down here. I'm not sure I would call this for a mean reverting price to sales ratio. If so, it's definitely over long periods of time. And if we look at the annual growth in sales per share, that is definitely not reverting to its mean. The mean is around 20%, but the growth started around 40% or even more in the 1970s, and gradually, but somewhat erratically, it decreased down to something like 5% in 2020. And before I understood that we should decompose the stock returns into these 3 components, this really puzzled me because I was looking at other things like return on equity and net profit margins and whatnot. And that's why I say in the paper, it's kind of embarrassing that I didn't see this before. I'm not really embarrassed about it because nobody else had derived these formulas before. And if you sit there and say, I knew this, this is trivial. Yeah, fuck you. You didn't write a paper, so shut the fuck up. All of this is very obvious in hindsight. But even Robert Shiller, whom they gave a Nobel Prize for his work on this stuff, in a lifetime of research, he didn't realize how all of this was connected. So it's not trivial. What it required for me to realize this was to look at it from the right angle. I had to look at the annualized return, where instead of looking at the share price, I would decompose that into its 3 different components. And then it suddenly made all sense, and all of the main formulas were derived in just 1 or 2 days. Then I refined them a little after that and simplified them a little and so on. But the breakthrough was quite quickly, but it required for me to look at it from the correct angle. And then it was obvious, not before. So anyway, the last plot is the dividend yield, and what you will note here is that there's a huge spike. And I get the share price data and the dividend data from Yahoo Finance, where you can download it for free. And I have noticed in a lot of the stocks for the older data in the 70s or 80s, there is this kind of strange spike. And I suspect it is because they haven't adjusted the dividends for the older data using stock splits. I think that might be the problem, but I'm not sure. But anyway, what we're going to use in this forecasting model is the mean. And for most of this 45-year period, the dividend yield was fairly close to its mean. So it doesn't really matter for us. So let's go to the next plot, where we see the historical 1-year returns for the Walmart stock. And overlaid is the forecasting model, which has been fitted with the mean of the historical data from the plots that you just saw. Once again, you see it has a horrible fit. The R-squared is now minus 2.18. And this is very typical for all stocks and stock indices, that for 1 year it doesn't work because the price to sales ratio does not have any predictive power for only 1 year returns. And the explanation is quite simply that the price to sales ratio doesn't revert so quickly to its mean. So let's look at the next plot, which is for 5-year annualized returns. And this is spread all over the place. There is some kind of lines here. Remember that dots with similar colors are for different periods in time. So we can see that different periods of time are located in different areas of the plot. And some of them do have these kind of curves that follow the same curvature of the forecasting model. But it's all over the place. Finally, let's try and look at 10-year annualized returns. And we see the same principle. Again, the colors show us that for different periods of time, it does have these downward sloping curves, but it's spread all over the place here. There are different levels. There's a level here, and a few zigzagging levels in between. Even though we get an R-squared value of 0.21, I would say this is completely useless. So what we're doing here is we're trying to fit the forecasting model using the historical averages for the dividend yield, the price to sales ratio, and the growth in sales per share. And then we get the solid black line here, and that is somewhere in the middle of all of these data points. Now that makes sense because it's the average. But what you will see in general in these scatter plots with historical stock returns and a forecasting model that has been fitted to historical data is that when you have outliers, it is because that particular period in history was far from the averages that you had assumed in the forecasting model. For example, let's go back to the plot that shows the price to sales ratio. So the average was about 0.8, but there was a period here from 1977 until 1987, where at the beginning the price to sales ratio was abnormally low at something like 0.35 or something like that. And at the end it was abnormally high at around 1.7. So the annualized return we get over this 10-year period from this revaluation from an abnormally low price to sales ratio to an abnormally high price to sales ratio is very far from the average. And furthermore, if we look at the plot for the historical sales growth, on average it was 20%, but in this period here in the 1970s and 80s, it was usually between 30 and 40%. And at the other end of the plot, between let's say 2005 and 2020, the sales growth was typically between let's say 12% and 5%. So both the sales growth and the price to sales ratio had periods where they were far from their mean, and that tends to show up as outliers in the plots, and that has been quite extreme for this example with the Walmart stock, where it shows up as levels like this. Now the first thing you might want to try in an example like that is simply to average over many periods. So For example, we can consider the investment periods between 6 and 10 years instead of exactly 10-year investment periods. But still we see these levels. In fact, they are probably even more clear in this plot here. In this paper, I also have a section on synthetic data, where we can artificially generate data so that we can see exactly what kind of data gives different results when we plot them and fit the forecasting model and so on. And I start with very simple data, which is just a cyclical curve for the price to sales ratio and constant 5% sales growth and a 0% dividend yield. But in the last example, I generate data that is more similar to Walmart. So the price to sales ratio is still cyclical, but it has noise in it. And the sales growth now goes from around 40% down to around 5%, again with noise in it. So this also looks like the Walmart data. And when we plot that for an average of 6 to 10 year investment periods, and we fit the forecasting model, we see something that looks surprisingly like the Walmart data. So generating synthetic or artificial data like this is very useful when you see something strange in real-world historical data. At first, when I looked at the Walmart data, I didn't understand why it looked like that. Then later I realized it was probably because of this decline in the sales growth from 40% at the beginning down to 5% at the end. And that was probably the reason why Walmart's data looked like that. And then we can test this hypothesis using artificial data. So it's a very useful tool to get to understand this better. So we have now seen two examples of two companies, Procter & Gamble and Walmart. One had very stable mean reverting historical data, that was Procter & Gamble, and one did not, that was Walmart. Like I said, when we derived these formulas, the formula is a precise mathematical relationship. If you can predict the future of the dividend yield, growth in sales per share, and the future price to sales ratio, then you can precisely predict the future stock return. It turned out that for Procter & Gamble, these three components had been mean reverting over the last several decades, but for Walmart, they had not. So the question is, how can you predict this in the future? For some stocks, you can do that. For some companies, you cannot do that. And it might be a lot easier to do this for broadly diversified stock indices, such as the S&P 500, which is an index of 500 large companies in the United States. So here we have the historical share price and the sales per share going back to 1990 until 2020. Again, the y-axis is logarithmic for this plot. And we see that they have sort of followed each other, but usually the share price is higher than the sales per share. And we can see that in the next plot, which is the ratio between those two. On average, it has been 1.4. I don't know if I want to call this cyclical. If it is, then it definitely has fairly long cycles. But we do see that in 1990, it was very low. Then gradually it increased to the year 2000, the so-called dot-com bubble, where it was more than 2. And then we had the financial crisis in 2009. And then it had gradually increased, especially during the Trump years, because Trump cut taxes and regulation, and that really boosted the American economy. And right before the corona crisis, we were at a historical high of 2.3 or something like that. When we are doing the forecasting, we are of course interested in what is going to happen in the future to the price to sales ratio. And because big tech companies are probably a bigger part of the S&P 500 now than they were in the dot-com bubble in 2000, maybe it is justified that because of all these big tech companies, the price to sales ratio should be higher in the future. In the forecasting model, you could simply say that instead of using the historical mean of 1.4, maybe it should be 2.0. Or maybe it should be 2.2, or maybe it should be 3. Who knows? But it's very easy to adjust that in the forecasting model. So now let's look at the sales growth. This looks more mean reverting with shorter cycles, and the mean has been around 4%. So if I were to use this forecasting model, I would probably just assume a future sales growth of 4.0% again. And finally, we have the dividend yield, and that went from 4% in 1990. It was at its lowest, almost 1, around year 2000, 2001. Financial crisis, it was high at 4% again. And then here, before the corona crisis, it was slightly below 2. In the paper, I have a discussion about share buybacks versus dividend yields, how that affects the forecasting model. The short answer is that it doesn't, provided you use data from the correct period, so that the annual growth in sales per share is taken from the same period where you have dividend yield. For the S&P 500, I actually have the dividend yield going back to, 1950 or something like that. But the sales per share data, I only have that going back to around 1990. So I cannot mix that data and use the dividend yield from the 1950s in the future because they didn't do share buybacks back then. Starting in the 1990s, they shifted a lot of the dividends over to share buybacks. And you have to use data that is consistent if you want to use the historical data in your forecasting model. So let's just try and take the averages for this historical data and use that in the forecasting model. And when we plot that along with the historical 1-year returns on the S&P 500, we get this plot here. And as usual, you can see it has a horrible fit because the price to sales ratio does not have any predictive power for just 1-year investment periods, because the price to sales ratio of the S&P 500 does not revert to its mean that quickly. So let's look at 5-year investment periods instead, and we can see it gets a lot better. Now the R-squared is 0.54, which is quite decent. And you see overall, for example, these orange dots, they tend to follow the curvature of the forecasting model, or this return curve as I call it. The same with these purple dots and the yellow dots as well, kind of. But there are some outliers. So let's try and look at 10-year annualized returns, and this is even better. Again, there are some outliers up here and down here, but most of the historical data points are within one standard deviation of the forecasting model. So now let's try and look at the average of 2 to 4 year investment periods. And here you can see when you're looking at the plot, you can see the curvature again already starting to show even for so short investment periods. But the R-squared is not very good. It's only 0.07. So for short investment periods, even when we are averaging over 2 to 4 years, the forecasting model is not that good for the S&P 500. But when we look at 4 to 6 year investment periods, the R-squared is 0.60, and it looks a lot better. Again, there are some outliers, and this is when we have periods where at the beginning, for example, the price to sales ratio is abnormally low, and at the end of the 4 to 6 year period, it is abnormally high, or vice versa, and then we get these outliers. But most of the data points are well within one standard deviation of the forecasting model, so already for 4 to 6 year investment periods, it has a quite good fit when looking at both the forecasting model's mean and its standard deviation. If we look at 6 to 10 year annualized return, it gets much better with an R-squared of 0.84, and we can see most of the data points are fairly close to the forecasting model's mean. So how do we actually use this to forecast the return from today and going 6 to 10 years into the future? Well, we use these forecasting formulas up here for the mean and the standard deviation with the price to sales ratio for today. And if we go into the text, I have made plenty of examples on how to calculate this. Here we have it for the S&P 500, and I wrote this in September 2020, so it was a few months ago. At that point, the price to sales ratio was 2.40. Oh, I can see I do it here for the 4 to 6 year investment periods, but it's the same principle. We just have different number here for the number A, which was 1.13. And then we insert the price to sales ratio from September 2020, which was 2.40. And that to the power of 1 divided by 5, because it's for 5-year investment period. Remember that was calculated exactly the same as for 4 to 6 years period, because 5 is the midpoint between 4 and 6 years. Then we subtract 1, and this is approximately minus 5.1%. So the forecasting model predicts that if we invest 5 years or between 4 and 6 years in the S&P 500 at a price to sales ratio of 2.40 at the beginning, then we would get a loss of minus 5.1%, mainly because the historical average price to sales ratio was only 1.4, and we used that in the forecasting model, so it assumes that the current price to sales ratio of 2.4 will go down to 1.4, and that loss will be spread over 5 years, but it will be made partially up from a sales growth, which was assumed to be 4.0%, and then a couple of percent for the dividend yield as well. And altogether, this gives a result of minus 5.1%. And also in these examples in the paper, I often do this using this simple forecasting model where I add these numbers together. And then you will see that the results are actually not exactly the same when you add them together and when you use the proper forecasting model as we do here, because that is multiplicative and the simple formula is additive. so there is a slight error. Now this minus 5.1% is the center of the forecast, and similarly we can use the formula for the standard deviation, and using the historical data we calculate the number B to be 0.076, and then we take the price to sales ratio for today, which was 2.40, to the power of 1 divided by 5. We divide these two, and in this case we do not subtract 1, as we just did in the formula for the mean. So what we get out of this is 6.4%. So now we have a mean forecast of minus 5.1% with a standard deviation of 6.4%. So the forecasting model thinks there's going to be a significant loss on the S&P 500 in the 5 years going forward, but there's a lot of uncertainty in that forecast, as it shows us with the standard deviation of 6.4%. So now we have formulas that can be used to forecast the mean and standard deviation of a stock or a stock market index based on our future expectations for the dividend yield, valuation ratio, and growth in sales per share. So the more precisely you can predict these three components for the future, the more precisely you can predict the future stock returns. And once again, this is almost embarrassingly obvious in hindsight. Maybe not the exact form of the formula, whether it is additive or multiplicative and so on. Maybe that part is not so obvious. And that is probably why these formulas have not been discovered before now. I have never seen this before. Robert Shiller didn't know it, and I'm not aware of anybody else either in academia or professional investors who have discovered this and published it before. And these formulas also fit the observations in the historical data that we didn't know how to fit previously. So this brings us to the end, and a lot of your questions might already have been answered in the paper leading up to this point, or maybe in the discussion section here. So please read that before you ask a question in the comments. I'll be very interested if anybody actually does further research on this, use it on different data sets, use different valuation ratios, whatever it might be. I'll be very interested in seeing that, and I wish you good luck.